There is a type of creativity that only happens when you are left alone long enough. Japanese folk art is largely the product of this type of creativity, a civilization that spent long stretches of its history sealed off from the world, and used that time to become remarkably good at what it already knew how to do. When you live on an island and the boats stop coming, you work with what you have. The clay under the hill behind the house, the tree in the valley that has always been used for lacquer, the plant whose leaves ferment into the blue that has been the color of work clothes for as long as anyone can remember. You push these materials further than anyone else has bothered to push them, because you have time, and because the materials under your feet are the only materials available. And after enough generations of pushing, the bowl becomes more than a bowl. The objects start carrying a weight that their function alone fails to explain. But the island kept its doors open for a long time before closing them. And before it did, it absorbed an enormous amount from everywhere it could reach. The great civilizations to the west, the mainland, the peninsula, the archipelagos to the south, poured into Japan across centuries of open contact, and Japan took everything they offered and processed it through its own climate and geography and sensibility until the foreign influence became unrecognizable as foreign. This is how Japan works with outside material. It imports it, lives with it for a few generations, and then produces a creation that could only have come from here. The pottery tradition that began as a direct transplant from the Korean peninsula, artisans brought over by force, making what they had always made in soil that belonged to a country that had taken them by force, transformed across centuries into the most distinctly Japanese ceramic tradition in the world. The lacquer technique that arrived from China grew into an expression so particular to the geography of certain Japanese peninsulas that it developed only here. The weaving traditions that filtered up from Southeast Asia through the island chains became textile traditions that looked, eventually, as though they had grown from the Japanese earth itself. This layering of foreign influence beneath a surface of intense local identity is one of the first things to understand about Japanese folk art. It grew in contact, absorbing freely from the beginning. It is a tradition that absorbed everything it could find and then, when the doors closed, went to work on what it had absorbed, refining it and pushing it and making it completely its own. Most craft traditions around the world have a fairly practical relationship with their own existence. You make things because people need them. You get better at making them over time. If you are good enough and lucky enough, people pay you well for what you make. The relationship between the maker and the made is contractual at its core. Skill in exchange for money, object in exchange for need. Japanese folk art is different, and the difference comes from philosophy, the collision between Buddhist ideas and the act of making things by hand, a collision that produced one of the more surprising arguments in the history of aesthetics. The argument goes roughly like this: the self is the enemy of beauty. When a craftsperson is thinking about what they are doing, worrying about whether it is good, hoping someone will admire it, calculating how to make it more impressive, all of that mental activity introduces a static between the intention and the object, and the object comes out slightly less alive as a result. The bowls that move people most powerfully, the cloth that catches the eye most powerfully, the lacquer that seems to glow from within, these were made by hands that had practiced so long they stopped thinking about what they were doing and simply did it. The knowledge so completely absorbed that the body acted ahead of the mind. The Japanese folk tradition has a word for this state, mushin, which translates roughly as empty mind, but means richer and more exact than the translation captures. It is the condition of absorbed, unself-conscious action, the state a great musician reaches in performance when the music flows through them, over from them, the state a master calligrapher achieves when the brush moves free of deliberation. In the context of craft, it is the state you reach after 10,000 bowls, when the hands know what to do free of instruction. The bowl made in this state carries a directness the bowl made in careful self-consciousness loses, the clarity of unmediated making, the directness of an action that bypassed the interference of ego. This is a strange thing to build a craft tradition around, and it has strange consequences. Chief among them is the tradition's relationship with anonymity. In most art traditions, the name of the maker is the whole story. A painting earns attention through the fame of its maker, and you value the pot because it came from a famous kiln. Japanese folk art, shaped by Buddhist philosophy, arrived at the opposite position. The signature on the object is an intrusion. It reminds you that a particular person made this particular thing, and that reminder pulls you away from the object itself and toward the person, which is the wrong direction to look. The folk craft tradition at its most philosophically rigorous produced anonymous objects made by craftspeople who considered themselves conduits over creators, vessels through which a tradition moved over individuals expressing themselves. Convincing or baffling depending on your temperament, it produced objects of astonishing directness. Bowls that hit you before you even think about who made them, cloth that affects you before you can place it in a category or attach it to a reputation. The Buddhist influence also gave Japanese folk art a dimension that very few craft traditions anywhere in the world possess, a metaphysics of ordinary objects. The rice bowl carries more than rice. Every object made with absorbed attention carries some record of the state in which it was made, and that state, calm, present, undistracted, is legible to anyone who handles the object, even if they struggle to explain how they are reading it. This is the tradition's central claim, and it is a large one. But spend enough time with the objects, and it becomes harder to dismiss than it sounds. The tea ceremony deserves its own long discussion because its influence on Japanese folk art is so pervasive that understanding the pottery requires the lacquerware, the iron kettles, the textiles, the architecture, or even the garden design of rural Japan, first reckoning with what the tea ceremony wanted and what it was willing to pay for. What it wanted, more than anything, was the opposite of what courts and wealthy patrons typically want. When power has money, it tends to want objects that announce that fact. Elaborate surfaces, expensive materials, technical virtuosity performed in a way announcing its difficulty. The tea ceremony emerged from a philosophical position that regarded all of this as noise. Its masters actively sought out objects that whispered over shouted, that wore their origins plainly over hiding them under layers of finish, that carried the marks of their making openly. A tea bowl with a slightly lopsided rim was more interesting than a perfectly symmetrical one. A water jar that looked as though it had been pulled from the earth that morning was more valued than one polished into smoothness. The bamboo ladle that looked effortless, almost accidental, was the ladle that stopped the room. The aesthetic this produced has a name, wabi, and defining it precisely is a fool's errand that scholars have been engaged in for centuries, which is itself probably a sign that it describes a real condition that resists easy capture. Gesturally, it points toward the beauty of the imperfect, the transient, the humble, the worn, the character that objects develop when they have been used and have aged and carry the evidence of their history. A tea bowl glazed in a color that varies unpredictably across its surface, because the kiln fire moved the glaze in ways the potter had zero control over, is more beautiful to this sensibility than a bowl glazed in a perfectly even color, because the irregular bowl contains a record of forces beyond the potter's control, a collaboration between human intention and natural process. The worn, asymmetrical, imperfect object tells a story. The technically perfect object speaks only of its maker's skill. The practical consequence of this aesthetic for Japanese folk art was enormous and somewhat paradoxical. The tea ceremony's masters traveled to remote pottery villages, places where potters had been making agricultural vessels for local farmers unaware of court taste or urban fashion, and found in the roughness of those vessels exactly the character they had been philosophizing about. They bought tea bowls that farmers had used to measure grain. They brought water jars from rural kilns into ceremonies attended by the highest levels of society. The anonymous craftsperson's work became the prize of the room, and the rough village bowl became, in certain circles, more coveted than elaborate courtware. This inversion, the rural and anonymous elevated above the sophisticated and signed, ran through Japanese folk art for centuries and is arguably its defining characteristic. The tea ceremony created a taste for objects that looked as though they were trying less, which had the paradoxical effect of making the things that were made with the least self-consciousness the most sought after. The village potter who had been making the same bowl for 30 years, free of any thought about whether it was beautiful, had, in the terms the tea tradition established, already achieved what the court ceramicist was straining toward. The goal was indistinguishable from the absence of trying to reach the goal. This is philosophically dizzying, and practically it meant that the entire prestige hierarchy of Japanese material culture was quietly upended by a ritual that involved boiling water and drinking from a bowl. One of the things that makes Japanese folk art so various, so full of traditions that bear almost zero resemblance to each other, each with its own logic and its own beauty, is the geography of the islands themselves. Japan is a long mountainous archipelago, which means it is full of valleys, and valleys mean isolation, and isolation means that a craft tradition dropped into one valley 50 years before the same tradition reaches the next valley can develop for 50 years into its own particular direction before the two versions ever encounter each other. By the time they do, they have become different things. This is why the indigo cloth of one province looks almost unrecognizable as the same tradition as the indigo cloth of the province behind the next mountain range. Same plant, same blue, same basic dyeing process, but 200 years of separation during which the craftspeople in each place were responding to their own local conditions, their own local patrons, their own local uses for the cloth. And the result is two traditions that share an ancestry but have arrived at completely different destinations. The pottery of one coastal city developed glazes from the local feldspar deposits that craftspeople 50 kilometers inland had zero reason to try. And over centuries those glazes became so identified with that place that you can hold a piece of the pottery and know roughly where it came from, free of any label or instruction. The lacquer tradition of a cold, damp peninsula evolved across many generations into an approach involving dozens of layers of application, each allowed to cure for weeks before the next was added, because the climate of that particular place happened to be ideal for the long, slow curing that the method required, and what emerged was an object of depth and richness that craftspeople elsewhere had zero reason to develop, because nowhere else had the same combination of conditions pointing them in that direction. This is geography as artist, the landscape shaping the craft as surely as the craftsperson's hand shapes the clay, pressing its character into every object produced within its boundaries. When you hold an object from a Japanese regional craft tradition, you are holding the accumulated influence of a place, the mineral composition of the local clay, the particular trees that grew within walking distance of the kiln, the local climate's patience or impatience with certain processes, the local aesthetic preferences developed over generations of people living close to each other and sharing ideas about what was beautiful. The object is a portrait of somewhere, as much as it is a portrait of the person who made it. This intensely local character is one of the things that makes Japanese folk art so resistant to generalization. It is hundreds of traditions, each tied to its place, each distinct, each carrying the mark of its geography as clearly as it carries the mark of its maker's hand. What unifies them is less a shared style than a shared set of conditions, the absorbed, anonymous making, the materials found nearby, the knowledge transmitted across generations, free of any written record, the beauty that arrived as a consequence of doing the work well over a long enough time. If you had to describe the inner logic of Japanese folk craft, what it thinks it is for, at the deepest level, three distinct orientations emerge, and understanding them helps make sense of why objects from such radically different traditions feel, despite their differences, like they belong to the same family. The oldest and largest orientation treats craft as pure service. The object exists to do a job, and everything about it is arranged around doing that job as well as possible. The bowl that holds rice, the cloth that keeps out the cold, the paper that divides the room from the wind, the iron kettle that heats the water for tea. These objects were made by craftspeople who thought of themselves as workers over artists, whose measure of success was whether the thing they made did what it was supposed to do, and whose relationship with beauty was the relationship you have with a thing you have been doing well for your whole life. It arrives as a consequence over a goal, the natural result of doing a thing with enough skill and attention over enough time. The folk objects made in this spirit have a directness that is almost impossible to achieve through deliberate aesthetic effort. They are beautiful because they are true, because every decision in their making was made in the service of function, and the function shaped them into the most honest possible version of themselves. The second orientation treats craft as a record of place, a form of regional identity made physical. These are the objects inseparable from their origin. that bear the mark of their geography so deeply that they are practically irreplicable elsewhere, and keep what matters that makes them worth replicating. The pottery that tastes of its local clay, the textile that carries the blue of its valley's indigo, the lacquerware that owes its depth to the patience a cold, humid peninsula requires. These objects are arguments for particularity, for the value of being from a particular place and remaining close to that place over reaching for a universality that flattens everything into sameness. In a world where globalization tends to produce objects that could have been made anywhere and therefore carry the character of nowhere, the regional Japanese folk tradition stands as a counter-argument, an insistence that where you are matters, that the materials under your feet, and the climate around you and the neighbors you have always had, are forces that press themselves into your work, whether the craftsperson intends it or resists it, and that the result of this pressing is a form of richness that technical skill alone fails to produce. The third orientation is the most unusual: craft as philosophy, as embodied argument, as objects that think. This is where Japan does a thing almost zero other folk traditions do to the same degree. It builds ideas into ordinary objects, woven into the fundamental logic of the object over-applied as decoration. The puzzle box whose opening sequence dies with its maker is an argument about impermanence and the limits of what can be transferred from one person to another, made physical in carved wood and sliding panels. The ceramic repaired with gold seams is an argument about the value of history, about damage as record over flaw, about beauty that deepens with use and age. The patched and repatched work clothes of a farming family, built up over decades of hard winters into a textile that records a whole life's worth of cold and necessity, are an argument about the dignity of materials and the autobiography hidden in ordinary things. These objects think in the way that poems think, by embodying ideas over stating them, by making you feel the argument ahead of any words for it. What unites all three orientations is absorption, the condition of making that happens when the craftsperson and the tradition and the material are all aligned, when the self stops supervising and the hands take over, when the object that emerges is more honest than anything deliberate effort could have produced. This is the condition that the tea ceremony masters were hunting for when they traveled to remote villages looking for tea bowls. It is the condition that collectors recognize but struggle to explain. It is the thing that makes a folk object hit you differently than a fine art object, with a directness that feels less like encountering a person's vision and more like encountering a truth. Here is a thought that tends to make people uncomfortable when they think about it too directly. Most of what was made in the Japanese folk tradition is gone. The bowl that held rice for 50 years and then broke and was thrown away. The cloth that kept someone warm for 20 winters and then disintegrated. The paper that divided the room from the wind and was eventually replaced and burned. The overwhelming majority of folk objects made with full absorption by anonymous craftspeople over the long history of Japanese craft did exactly what they were supposed to do, served their function for as long as they held together, and disappeared. The objects we have are the exceptions, the ones that were considered precious enough to be kept, or were stored and forgotten and survived by accident, or were made so well that they outlasted the conditions that would have destroyed them. This means that our understanding of Japanese folk art is necessarily skewed toward the remarkable end of what was actually made. The tea bowls in museum collections were collected precisely because someone recognized them as exceptional. The textile traditions we can study are the ones that attracted enough attention to be preserved and passed on. The craft villages we know about are the ones someone wrote about, photographed, fought to protect. The traditions that disappeared did so quietly, their practitioners outliving their apprentices, their materials running out, their products priced out of the market by industrial alternatives, their knowledge evaporating free of any written record, because folk knowledge is the kind that lives in the body, unreachable through books. This pattern of discovery and preservation is itself one of the most interesting threads in the Japanese folk art story, because it recurs so consistently across so many different traditions. A remote village makes beautiful things for centuries, unaware that the rest of the world would consider them beautiful. A traveler arrives, a philosopher, a collector, a merchant with a discerning eye, and recognizes a character the villagers themselves have stopped seeing because they have always lived with it. Word travels. The outside world arrives. Prices change. The tradition changes with the prices, sometimes for the better, and sometimes in ways that gradually hollow the character that made it worth noticing in the first place. The remoteness that produced the beauty is gone, replaced by a different register of attention, and the tradition has to find a new way to maintain the absorbed, unself-conscious character that made it remarkable in an environment where it is now famous and scrutinized and commercially successful. Some traditions navigated this transition and held their character. Others became successful in a way that made them ordinary. The difference, when you look closely, almost always comes down to whether the craftspeople themselves understood what they were doing well enough to protect it, whether the tradition was articulable enough that it could survive being written about, exhibited, and sold to people who came from somewhere else. The traditions built on the deepest, least articulable knowledge were the ones most vulnerable to disruption, because the knowledge that lived only in the hands was the knowledge most easily lost the moment the hands stopped moving. There is a thread running through the history of Japanese folk art that tends to get underplayed in the appreciative accounts. A great deal of it was made by people with very few choices. The Korean potters brought to Japan by force across several centuries of conflict were among the most consequential arrivals in Japanese craft history. They built kilns, they trained apprentices, their descendants became the founders of several of Japan's most celebrated ceramic traditions, producing work that Japan now considers among its most precious cultural heritage. The origin story, capture, relocation, enforced labor in a foreign land, sits beneath this achievement like a foundation that nobody mentions at the exhibition opening. The women who made boro textiles in the agricultural regions of northern Japan were making them because winters were severe and resources were minimal, and the alternative was cold. The aesthetic that later collectors found so moving, the accumulated layers of repair, the visual record of decades of survival, was the record of real hardship. The beauty was real, so was the cold. The collector who paid a year's salary for a boro jacket at auction was paying for an object made by someone who had pressed it on a truck driver for free because she was ashamed of it. The gap between those two valuations is a violence too, quieter but present all the same. The folk art tradition in Japan has always had this dual nature. It was made by people living close to the edge of poverty, of climate, of political powerlessness, and the conditions that produced the most beautiful work were also the conditions that produced the hardest lives. The isolated mountain village that kept its craft tradition pure for 200 years was also isolated from medicine, from education, from the social mobility that might have let its craftspeople choose a different life. The tradition survived partly because the people inside it had limited options for leaving it. That is a fact the aesthetic appreciation tends to step around, but it is worth sitting with. The objects are unchanged by this. The bowl is beautiful. The cloth is alive with the record of the hands that made it. The gold-seamed ceramic carries its argument about damage and time. But the full story of Japanese folk art includes the circumstances of its making, and those circumstances were often circumstances of constraint, political, economic, geographic, that produce beauty as a side effect of lives that were hard, made by people who would probably have preferred easier ones. The tradition itself has an awareness of this. The aesthetic of wabi, the beauty of the worn and humble and imperfect, is partly a philosophical position and partly a coping mechanism. A way of finding value in the conditions of your actual life over the life you might prefer. The bowl with the uneven rim is beautiful because it was made by hand under time pressure by someone who had been making bowls all day. The worn work jacket is beautiful because someone wore it for 30 winters and mended it every time it gave out. The beauty is inseparable from the use, and the use is inseparable from the necessity, and the necessity was real. Most people, when they think of Japan, think of the main islands, Honshu, Kyushu, Shikoku. They think of Tokyo and Kyoto, of samurai and cherry blossoms, of the Japan that Japan itself most often exports to the world's imagination. Okinawa sits 500 miles to the south, in a warm sea, and for most of its history, it was a completely separate kingdom with its own language, its own music, its own food, and its own textile traditions so distinct and so alive that they constitute a folk art world unto themselves. The Bingata tradition is the one that stops people in their tracks. Bingata is a method of dyeing fabric using stencils and pigment, producing patterns of such chromatic intensity, deep indigo pressing against burning orange, gold floating above turquoise, that the cloth looks lit from within. The patterns are drawn from the natural world of Okinawa: fish, flowers, birds, waves, the specific creatures and plants of a subtropical island kingdom. They were worn by the royal court and by the aristocracy, which would seem to disqualify them as folk art, except that the people who made them were skilled craftsmen working in family workshops, passing technique from parent to child, operating within a tradition so specific to their place and their materials that it could have arisen nowhere else on Earth. Japan has a relationship with folk toys that is unlike anything in Western tradition, and to understand it, you have to abandon the idea that a toy is a simple thing. The Daruma doll is a good place to start. It is a round, red, weighted figure that rights itself when knocked over, modeled on the Buddhist monk Bodhidharma, who, according to legend, sat in meditation so long that his arms and legs atrophied and fell off, which the tradition treats as admirable, even enviable. The Daruma arrives with both eyes blank. The owner paints in one eye when setting a goal or making a wish, and paints in the second eye when the goal is achieved. The doll sits on the shelf through the whole period of the attempt, watching with its single painted eye, a daily reminder of the thing that was promised. This is a folk object doing philosophical and psychological work that most fine art steps around entirely. The Daruma is a contract between a person and their own intention, made concrete in painted papier-mâché. The unfinished eye is a form of accountability. When the year ends and the goal is met, the Daruma is brought to a temple and burned, which is the tradition's way of saying, this period is complete, this intention has been honored. Let it go. Folk toys in Japan were intensely regional. Specific animals, in specific postures, made from specific local materials, carried specific symbolic meanings that shifted from village to village. A wooden horse from one prefecture meant something entirely different from a wooden horse 2 valleys over. The beckoning cat, the maneki neko with its raised paw, originated in Tokyo, but migrated across the country, accumulating new meanings and new versions as it traveled, each region giving it its own colors and materials and stories. The same object, across different hands and different places, became several different objects. The kokeshi doll deserves its own discussion because it is one of the stranger and more moving stories in Japanese folk art. Kokeshi are simple wooden figures made on a lathe, a cylindrical body, a round head, painted with simple flowers or geometric patterns. They come from the mountain hot spring resorts of the Tohoku region in northern Japan, where they were sold to visitors as souvenirs beginning in the early 19th century. They look simple. They look, to a Western eye, almost primitive. The face is a few brushstrokes. The body is a smooth cylinder. There are scholars who believe the original kokeshi were memorial objects, that they were made by craftsmen whose infant daughters had died, that each doll represents a child lost in infancy, and that what looks like a simple toy is actually a form of mourning made portable and sellable, grief transformed into craft and sent out into the world in the hands of strangers. This interpretation is disputed, but looking at a kokeshi with that story in your mind transforms the object entirely. The simplicity becomes weight. The smooth, featureless body becomes restraint. The few brushstroke flowers become flowers left at a small grave. Before synthetic dyes remade the textile industry in the late 19th century, Japan was a civilization saturated in indigo. Every class, region, and occupation had its relationship with this particular blue, the blue of work clothes and festival garments, of fishing nets and samurai accessories, of curtains hung in doorways and banners carried into markets. The indigo plant was grown in the Tokushima region on the island of Shikoku, where the climate and the soil produced a crop of particular intensity. The process of transforming the plant into dye involved fermentation over weeks, a living process that required constant attention, that could fail in cold weather or with inattentive tending, that produced a vat of material that experienced dyers described as having moods. The vat needed to be kept warm, it needed to be stirred, it needed to be read. This sounds like personification, And it is. But it is also accurate description. Experienced indigo dyers could tell by the smell, the color, the behavior of the foam on the surface of the vat, whether the fermentation was proceeding well. They talked about the vat the way a baker talks about a sourdough starter, as something alive that required relationship, that rewarded attention, that punished neglect. The knowledge of how to read a vat was the most valuable thing a dye house possessed, more valuable than the equipment or the materials. Japanese indigo dyeing also produced a family of resist dyeing techniques, methods of protecting portions of the cloth from dye to create patterns, that reached levels of intricacy and beauty that remain technically staggering even now. Shibori, the tradition of binding, folding, twisting, and compressing cloth before dyeing to create patterns through resistance, produces results that look designed with meticulous precision, but emerge from processes of controlled chance. You fold the cloth in a particular way, you compress it between wooden blocks, you dip it in the vat, and when you unfold it, the pattern appears, close to what you intended, yet shaped by forces you released and then surrendered, shaped by the way the dye traveled through the compressed fibers, by the specific weight of that piece of cloth, by 100 variables that the craftsperson sets in motion and then releases. The finest shibori work, held up to light, reveals layers of blue so subtly gradated from pale sky to near black that the cloth appears to contain its own atmosphere. These were work textiles. They were worn in fields and workshops. They were washed until they faded to the particular silvery blue that old indigo achieves, which experienced dyers consider more beautiful than the fresh color. They aged into themselves. Japanese folk religion is a layered, generous, hospitable thing, a deep bed of animist Shinto belief, underneath which Buddhism arrived and made itself comfortable, settling in beside what was already there. The result is a spiritual landscape in which a mountain, river, large tree, and strangely shaped rock might contain a kami, a spirit or divine presence, and in which the boundary between the sacred and the domestic is more suggestion than wall. This produced a folk art tradition of votive objects and sacred images that is unlike anything in the Western religious tradition, because it is less interested in grandeur than in intimacy. The small stone Jizo statues that stand at roadsides and mountain paths, dressed by local people in hand-knitted red bibs and hats, are folk art in the most direct possible sense, made by ordinary hands, expressing a devotion that is personal and local and continuous. The bibs are replaced when they wear out. The offerings of small stones and flowers are refreshed. The statues accumulate coats of moss and histories of care. Ima are wooden votive plaques, hung at Shinto shrines, painted with the image of the shrine's sacred horse on one side, and inscribed with a personal prayer or wish on the other. The tradition of professionally painted ima, sold at shrine shops for worshippers to inscribe and hang, produced an entire genre of small, vivid, painted images. Horses in every posture, painted with a directness and energy that formal painting rarely achieves. But the ima people painted themselves, the ones covered in the careful handwriting of ordinary people, asking for health and love and success in exams, are objects of a different order entirely. They are prayers made visible, a forest of individual human hopes hanging in the wind. The tradition of paper lanterns, of the decorated bamboo wares made for summer festivals, of the painted fans distributed as temple gifts, of the small ceramic figures placed in household shrines. All of this constitutes a visual world that operated in parallel with the official art history of Japan, below the notice of the Academy, serving the daily spiritual life of ordinary people with a directness and a beauty that official religious art, stiffened by institutional expectation, rarely managed to equal. When Yanagi Soetsu founded the Japan Folk Crafts Museum in Tokyo in 1936, he filled it with objects that the art world of his time considered beneath collection. Korean rice bowls, Okinawan textiles, Ainu wood carvings from the indigenous people of Hokkaido, peasant pottery from anonymous kilns in provinces no collector had bothered to visit. Baskets, dyed cloth. The museum's founding collection was assembled by Yanagi and a small circle of artist friends. The potters Hamada Shoji and Kawai Kanjiro, the woodblock printer Munakata Shiko, who traveled the country looking for objects that had what they called beauty of use. They were looking for things made with complete absorption, things where the hand of the maker had moved freely within a tradition, things that served their function so well and so directly that the function by itself became beautiful. The man who collected garbage. For 40 years, a textile dealer named Chuzaburo Tanaka drove a truck through the farming villages of northern Japan and asked people if he could take their old rags. They thought he was eccentric at best. At worst, they felt sorry for him. The farmers and fishermen of the Tohoku region had spent generations trying to climb out of the poverty that produced those rags, the layers of patched indigo cloth, the bedding assembled from decades of accumulated mending, the work jackets that had been repaired so many times. The original cloth was a ghost underneath 40 years of patches. These objects were the evidence of hardship. They were the things you burned when you finally had enough money to buy a fresh garment. And here was this man in a truck, asking if he could have them. Many families gave them away for free. Some paid him to take the things away, the way you pay someone to haul rubbish. Tanaka filled warehouses with what he collected, which he called boro, the Japanese word for tattered rags, a word that carries zero poetry in Japanese, only the flat factual description of cloth worn past dignity. He documented the objects, catalogued them, spent his own money preserving them. Nobody in the art world knew his name. The folk craft world considered what he was doing unremarkable. He just kept driving. When the Amuse Museum in Tokyo finally exhibited his collection in the early 2000s, the art world walked in and fell silent. Fashion designers from Paris and New York arrived and made notes with slightly shaking hands. A single boro jacket, the kind a Tohoku farmer's widow had pressed on Tanaka with relief, grateful to have it gone, was selling at auction for more money than the family that made it had earned in several years. Tanaka had spent 4 decades collecting what the world was about to decide was priceless. He had known before anyone else, and the families who had handed him their grandmother's rags for free were left to make of that whatever they could. Kintsugi is the most widely known story in Japanese folk art, and also the most misunderstood one. Kintsugi, the practice of repairing broken ceramics with lacquer mixed with powdered gold, silver or platinum, is usually presented as a philosophy of embracing imperfection, of finding beauty in damage, of treating the history of an object as part of its value. This is accurate, but it is also the version of kintsugi that has been smoothed down for motivational posters and Instagram captions, and the smoothing has removed the most compelling parts. The actual practice of kintsugi is demanding, time-consuming, and requires the depth of skill that takes years to develop. The lacquer used is urushi, a material harvested from lacquer trees that causes severe allergic reactions in most people who encounter it unprotected, that requires controlled humidity and temperature to cure properly, that demands patience measured in weeks and months between each stage of application. A properly repaired piece might pass through a dozen stages of lacquer application and polishing before the gold is applied. The finished repair is more durable than the original clay. What this means is that kintsugi is the opposite of a quick philosophical gesture. It is a sustained act of attention paid to a broken object over an extended period of time. The person who chooses to repair a bowl this way is making a commitment to the bowl, to the process, to the idea that this object is worth the months of skilled work its repair requires. The gold seams are the visible record of that commitment. They are beautiful, but the beauty is secondary to the faithfulness they represent. There is a moment that Yanagi described from his first visit to a working pottery village, watching an old woman paint a pattern onto an unfired bowl with a speed and fluency that made him feel he was watching calligraphy, or watching someone write a word they had written 10,000 times and could write blindfolded. The pattern appeared in seconds. It was perfect. It was alive in the way that deliberate, careful painting so rarely achieves. He asked her how long she had been painting this pattern. She considered the question as though it was slightly unusual. Since she was a girl, she said. Her mother had taught her. Her grandmother had taught her mother. She had painted this pattern or patterns like it every day of her working life for 50 years. This is the knowledge that lives in Japanese folk art, held in the objects, but most fully alive in the hands and memories and daily practice of the people who make them. It is knowledge that transfers poorly to books and classrooms and YouTube tutorials. It transfers through proximity, through years of watching and then doing, through the 1,000 failures that precede the moment when the hand finally moves with the confidence of someone who has forgotten they are making a decision. A geometry that lives in the hands. There is a test you can do with a tamari ball, one of the silk-embroidered spheres that Japanese mothers made for their daughters across 3 centuries, that tends to make mathematicians go quiet. Pick up an old tamari, one made by a farm woman in the 19th century who had no formal education, who had passed her whole life without a geometry textbook. Look at the pattern. It will divide the sphere with the precision of a mathematically derived formula. The interlocking stars will align exactly. The angles will be correct. The divisions of the sphere that produce the pattern, the invisible geometric scaffolding that had to be established before the embroidery could begin, will correspond to the same principles that a university mathematician would use if asked to solve the same problem on paper. The farm women who made these balls were operating through what the body learns when it has performed a task 10,000 times, a form of knowing so deep it bypasses conscious thought. The hands knew where the needle should go. The eye calibrated the angles through accumulated experience instead of calculation. The geometry was real and exact, and it lived in the fingers. What the mathematicians go quiet about is the implication. We have built enormous institutions, universities, textbooks, centuries of formal pedagogy around the project of transmitting this kind of spatial knowledge. And here it was, traveling perfectly from mother to daughter in a farmhouse in a prefecture most people would struggle to find on a map, carried in silk thread and patient repetition, arriving intact across 200 years. The ball itself was a toy. It was meant to roll across a floor, to be thrown and caught, to be handled until it wore out. The geometry inside it was incidental to its purpose, but the geometry is what stopped the mathematicians. In the summer of 1931, the philosopher Yanagi Suetsu and the potter Hamada Shoji got lost in the mountains of Kyushu trying to find a village called Onta. They had heard about it secondhand. A cluster of 10 pottery households in a steep valley, working clay with a water-powered crusher, making the same agricultural ware they had made for 200 years. They had driven as far as the roads allowed and then walked, following increasingly uncertain directions, getting progressively muddier and more disheveled as the path declined. By the time they stumbled into the valley, they looked far from the distinguished cultural figures they were. They looked like men who had been lost in the mountains. The potters of Onta assumed they had come to assess taxes. This detail matters because it captures exactly the gap between what Yanagi thought he was doing, embarking on a pilgrimage to an artistic holy site, and what the potters of Onta thought was happening, an unexpected and somewhat alarming visit from officialdom. The pots that Yanagi would later describe as among the most significant folk objects in Japan were sitting on shelves waiting to be loaded onto carts and taken to market. They were storage jars and sake bottles. They were things farmers bought because they needed a vessel to put things in. Yanagi picked up a sake bottle and felt, as he later described it, that the object was alive in his hands in a way that most objects he encountered were absent. He tried to explain this to Hamada. Hamada, who was himself one of the great potters of the 20th century, held the bottle and agreed. They bought everything they could carry. They walked back down the mountain considerably heavier than they had come up. The potters of Onta watched them go, presumably relieved the visit had been about pottery and not taxation after all. What happened next is the folk art version of discovering a previously unknown civilization. Yanagi's writings about Onta circulated through the cultural world of Tokyo. Critics came, collectors came, the pots began appearing in galleries, and the potters of Onta, who had been making the same vessels in the same valley the same way for 2 centuries, found themselves suddenly the subject of the attention that reshapes traditions, whether the tradition welcomes it or refuses it. There is a word in Japanese, tsukumogami, that describes the moment an object acquires a soul. After 100 years of existence, the thinking goes, any object can wake up. It develops awareness, personality, sometimes mischief. An old umbrella left in a corridor, a worn sandal, a beloved wooden comb. The world, in this understanding, is densely populated with presences we tend to overlook. This is the atmosphere in which Japanese doll art was born and has always lived. To understand the dolls, their forms, their purposes, the extraordinary care lavished upon them, you have to first accept this premise, that objects are porous, that the boundary between the human and the made thing is thin, permeable, and in certain conditions dissolves entirely. Western traditions tend to think of a doll as a copy of a person, a miniature human, useful for play or display. Japanese doll culture carries a completely different assumption. A doll is a vessel. It holds something. It might hold a prayer, a wish, a piece of someone's soul, a lingering grief, a hope for a daughter's future, a protective spirit standing guard over a house. The doll is made, yes, but once made, it participates in life. It acts. This is why, to this day, Japan holds doll funerals. When a family decides it is time to part with a beloved doll, perhaps an heirloom grown too fragile, perhaps a childhood toy whose owner has grown old, the doll is brought to a temple. Priests conduct a formal ceremony. The doll is thanked for its service. It is given a proper send-off. Throwing it in the rubbish would be unthinkable, the equivalent of abandoning a faithful companion. If this sounds extreme, consider how attached you have been, at some point in your life, to a stuffed animal or a childhood toy. The Japanese simply took that feeling seriously and built an entire philosophical framework around it, which, honestly, seems more honest than pretending the feeling does not exist. Part 2. The transfer. How dolls carry what we cannot. The oldest and most fundamental use of dolls in Japan is as a substitute body. The logic is ancient and appears across many cultures, but Japan developed it with particular sophistication. If something threatening approaches, illness, misfortune, the malice of spirits, the dangers of a new year, you can redirect it. You make a figure that resembles you, you breathe your identity into it, and the threat attaches to the doll instead of to you. In the early spring ritual that eventually became the Hinamatsuri, the great doll festival still celebrated every March, families would craft simple paper figures, pass them over their bodies to transfer impurities, and then send them floating down rivers to the sea. The water carried the trouble away. The figure, having absorbed what needed to be removed, disappeared with the current. Over centuries, something interesting happened. The paper figures became more elaborate. People began to put more care into them, then more still. Then artisans got involved, and before long, what had been a disposable ritual object had transformed into an extraordinary art form. The elaborate Hina dolls that represent an entire imperial court, dressed in silk, arranged on tiered platforms, passed down through generations as family treasures. This is one of the most charming patterns in cultural history, the ritual object that refuses to stay humble. The more humans handle something, the more they tend to pour love into it. And love, in Japan, often expresses itself as craft. The Hina dolls that Japanese families display today are extraordinary objects, a complete set, empress and emperor at the top, court ladies below, musicians, ministers, servants, tiny furniture, miniature food, and sake vessels arranged on 5 or 7 tiers of red-draped steps can represent generations of accumulated investment, both financial and emotional. Some families have sets that are 200 years old. The dolls are stored in individual silk bags, wrapped in tissue, packed into cedar boxes during the 11 months they spend in storage. There is even a superstition, delightfully specific, that if you leave the Hina dolls out past March 4th, your daughter will have difficulty finding a husband. This has the practical effect of ensuring the dolls get packed away promptly, which in turn ensures they survive to be passed to the next generation. Cultural wisdom wearing the costume of superstition. Part 3. The wooden cylinder and its infinite variations. In the cold mountain regions of northern Japan, a completely different doll tradition took shape. Here, in the communities of woodworkers who lived along the valleys connecting the high country to the hot spring towns, craftsmen began making small wooden figures on their lathes. These were the kokeshi, a round head on a simple cylindrical body, no arms, no legs, painted with a face and a pattern suggesting a kimono. The kokeshi is an object lesson in how limitation generates beauty. The lathe produces a cylinder. The cylinder becomes the body. The sphere becomes the head. That is all. Within this severe constraint, craftsmen found infinite room for variation and expression. The proportions of head to body, the way the grain of the wood shows through the paint, the eyes, sometimes wide and innocent, sometimes slanted and knowing, sometimes barely there, just 2 brushstrokes suggesting a gaze. Each valley, over generations, developed its own style. The craftsmen of one area made dolls with large heads and simple bold patterns. Those of another area preferred elongated bodies and delicate floral designs. A practiced eye can identify a kokeshi's origin, the way a wine drinker can identify a region by its taste. The doll carries its geography inside it. Travelers would arrive at the hot spring resorts exhausted from mountain roads, soak in the mineral waters, and carry home a kokeshi as evidence of the journey. A souvenir, yes, but also a small piece of a place, the hands of a craftsman who lived there. The local wood, the local style accumulated over generations. There is something almost meditative about the best kokeshi. They ask nothing of you. They sit quietly on a shelf and are simply present. In an age of objects that demand your attention with notifications and movement and noise, a wooden cylinder with a painted face has a certain radical calm. Part 4. The round red figure and the patience of goals. Perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated object in all of Japanese folk art is the daruma, that round, red, weighted figure with the blank white eyes. It is based on the legendary Indian monk who brought Zen Buddhism to China, a man said to have meditated so intensely and for so long that his arms and legs withered away. This is why the daruma has no limbs. It is a figure of pure, concentrated intention. The way you use a daruma is this. When you decide on a significant goal, you take the doll and paint in one eye. The figure now watches you with a single eye. It is waiting. You put it somewhere visible, on your desk, on a shelf at eye level, and it becomes a daily reminder, a silent witness to your commitment. Only when the goal is achieved do you paint in the second eye. The round weighted base means the daruma always rights itself when knocked over. Push it, and it returns to upright. This is the quality it is meant to embody and transfer: resilience, persistence, the refusal to stay down. The Japanese phrase that captures this is nana korobi ya oki, fall 7 times, rise 8. Daruma come in different colors for different purposes: red for general luck and achievement, gold for wealth, white for love and harmony. At New Year's markets and temple fairs across Japan, vendors sell them in enormous quantities. The sight of a successful politician holding up a just completed daruma, both eyes finely painted in, is one of the enduring images of Japanese public life. What is particularly beautiful about the daruma as an object is that its incompleteness is part of its meaning. A daruma with one eye painted is more interesting than one with two. It is a story in progress. It holds the tension of an unresolved commitment. There is an argument that the most alive works of art are always the ones that feel unfinished, that point towards something beyond themselves. Part 5. The craft mind. What making slowly does to the maker. To watch a traditional doll maker work is to observe a different relationship with time. The Kyoto artisans who make the finest Hina dolls spend weeks on a single figure. The face, made from the crushed shell of oysters mixed with glue, built up in many thin layers, sanded between each, takes days alone. The surface that results has a quality that is almost skin-like, warm in certain lights, with a depth that flat paint cannot approach. The hair is real hair. The silk is woven specifically for dolls, patterns scaled down to suit figures that stand 20 centimeters tall. The tiny lacquered accessories, the fans, the ox carts, the sake stands, the miniature musical instruments are made by separate specialist artisans who do nothing else. A complete high-quality Hina set is the product of perhaps a dozen different crafts, each practiced at a level that requires a lifetime to master. This level of investment raises an obvious question. Why? The dolls spend 11 months a year in boxes. They are displayed for a single month. Many owners, once they have a set, will rarely look at them closely. They are not, in any practical sense, useful. The answer lies somewhere in the Japanese concept of monozukuri, the art of making things. In this tradition, the quality of an object is inseparable from the quality of attention given to it during its creation. An object made with full attention carries that attention inside it. You may display the doll for 1 month, but the care that went into it accumulates over a lifetime of making and a lifetime of keeping. The object becomes a record of devotion. There is also the question of what slow, meticulous craft does to the person practicing it. The repeated fine movements, the absolute requirement of focus, the long hours in which the hands know what to do and the mind can wander free. This state is quite close to meditation. Many traditional craftspeople describe their work in terms that sound more like spiritual practice than labor. Part 6. The regional voice. How place speaks through form. Japan is a country of pronounced regional identities, and nowhere is this more visible than in folk art. The doll traditions of different areas are as distinct as dialects, shaped by local materials, local histories, local aesthetics, and local gods. From Fukushima comes the akabeko, a small red papier-mâché cow with a bobbing head. Legend places its origin at a temple construction site where an ox worked so faithfully and finally refused to leave that it was memorialized in this form. The red color came later, associated with protection against smallpox. Generations of mothers have given akabeko to young children as a first charm against illness. From Tottori, on the Sanin coast, comes the sand doll, made from the fine sand of the famous dunes, pressed into molds and painted with delicate colors, an object that carries its landscape inside its body in the most literal possible way. From Hakata in Kyushu come the clay dolls of extraordinary refinement, figures of beautiful women, kabuki actors, and seasonal subjects made from the white clay of the region, with a characteristic soft glaze and a sensibility that is somehow simultaneously monumental and delicate. Each of these traditions developed because a particular place had particular materials, particular needs, and particular craftspeople who found a form that worked and then refined it, generation by generation, until it reached a kind of perfection within its own terms. This is what folk art does. It solves problems slowly, beautifully, and over enormous stretches of time. Part 7. The doll that stares back, uncanny beauty and the Japanese aesthetic. There is a quality in many Japanese dolls that Western visitors sometimes find unsettling. A stillness that feels watchful, a beauty that carries within it something slightly uncomfortable. The eyes are often too perfect, the features too composed. You feel, looking at the finest Kyoto dolls, that you are being observed. This is not accidental. The Japanese aesthetic tradition has always been comfortable with the uncanny, with beauty that carries a shadow, with perfection that implies its own transience. The concept of mono no aware, roughly translated as the bittersweet awareness of impermanence, runs through Japanese art like a river through landscape. The cherry blossoms are beautiful precisely because they fall. The doll is affecting precisely because it holds, perfectly frozen, a face that will outlast its maker. The most prized quality in a doll face is something artisans call hana, a word that also means flower, and also means the peak of beauty, and also carries within it the understanding that peaks are temporary. A face with hana has a quality that cannot be fully explained. It seems alive. It seems about to speak. It holds, in its stillness, the suggestion of movement. The ink-black hair of a fine hyena doll is set in a specific style from a specific period of court history. The painted eyebrows sit high on the forehead, as was the fashion of aristocratic women in the Heian period, a millennium ago. The faces look inward. They are at a great distance from you, even when you hold them in your hands. They inhabit a different time. Part 8. The living tradition. What survives and what changes. Japanese doll culture is very much alive, and like all living things, it is changing. The traditional crafts are under the pressures that all traditional crafts face. Young people moving to cities, the long apprenticeship required, the difficulty of competing with machine-made alternatives. Some regional traditions have only a handful of practitioners left. At the same time, something interesting is happening at the other end. Contemporary Japanese artists are taking doll-making traditions and pushing them in directions their originators could never have imagined. Artist dolls, ichimatsu ningyu made as fine art rather than traditional craft, command extraordinary prices at auction and are collected internationally. These figures, hyper-realistic in their detail, push the uncanny quality of the doll toward a kind of conceptual edge. The kokeshi, meanwhile, has become a design icon. Its clean form, its reduction of the human figure to almost nothing while retaining something essential. These qualities have made it endlessly reinterpretable. Contemporary designers use it as a starting point. Collectors from across the world pursue rare vintage pieces. A humble woodworker's souvenir from the mountain towns of northern Japan now appears in design museums in Europe and America. The daruma continues to sell in the millions. Every January, at temple fairs across Japan, people arrive in the cold morning to buy new ones for the New Year's goals. Politicians hold them up at victory celebrations. Athletes paint eyes into them after winning championships. The form is 4 centuries old and shows no sign of fading. Coda, the small figure and the large feeling. There is something in the human need to make small figures that seems to go very deep. Dolls appear in every culture that has ever left archaeological evidence. We make them from whatever is at hand. We invest them with whatever we most need to process. Fear, hope, grief, celebration, the faces of the dead, the wishes of the living. Japan took this universal impulse and gave it centuries of sustained attention. The result is a doll culture of extraordinary depth and variety, in which the same fundamental gesture, making a small human form and caring for it, opens out in 100 different directions, each shaped by a different region, a different purpose, a different aesthetic philosophy. What the Japanese doll tradition ultimately teaches, if you spend time with it, is something about the relationship between scale and meaning. These are small objects, you can hold them in one hand, and yet within that small form, it is possible to compress an entire cosmology. Ideas about the soul, about time, about the relationship between the made thing and the maker, about what it means to pass something precious from one generation to the next. A grandmother in Kyoto unpacks her Hina dolls in February, unwrapping each one from its silk bag with the same care she watched her own grandmother use. The doll's face, unchanged for 200 years, looks back at her with that composed inward gaze. Something passes between them. Call it memory, or continuity, or simply the warmth that moves through careful hands. Call it what you like, the doll holds it.